The brace worked perfectly when Aaron Calder proved that was the problem. Security blocked the Cedars-Sinai hallway. The Palo Alto medical team insisted the device functioned within tolerance. Lila Moreno, 19, clenched her jaw so hard her neck muscles stood like cables. The pain had worsened with every upgrade across 4 years. But what Aaron discovered in the pressure data destroyed everything Maribel had spent millions building. The brace wasn't broken. It had been engineered with precision across Stanford, Houston, Boston, and Zurich to shift Lila's weight backward, preventing falls she'd never been at risk of having, fighting the very recovery it was supposed to create. The 8 seconds she stood without the device? That only happened after Aaron walked away. Drop a comment where you're watching from, and subscribe before expertise becomes the reason you ignore what's actually happening. Because Aaron is about to discover how many federal agencies will fight to erase progress that never followed their protocols. Aaron Calder held the tablet at eye level, so the lead orthopedist couldn't look away from the MRI scan, and that's when security moved to block the hallway at Cedars-Sinai. The medical team from Palo Alto had been insisting for 20 minutes that the spinal brace was functioning within tolerance, their voices measured and clinical, even as the girl in the wheelchair clenched her jaw so hard. The muscles in her neck stood out like cables. Her name was Lila Moreno, 19 years old, and the device biting into her spine had been redesigned 3 times across 3 states, yet somehow the pain kept escalating every time they promised improvement. Aaron didn't raise his voice once during the confrontation. Didn't need to, because the scans on the screen showed compression patterns that shouldn't exist if the brace was distributing weight correctly, and everyone in that corridor knew it the moment he angled the tablet toward the fluorescent lights. He wasn't supposed to be there at all. Aaron fixed agricultural machinery in Riverside County, spent his nights rebuilding prosthetic components for veterans who couldn't afford factory replacements, and the 60-mile drive from Indio at dawn had left dust on his boots that didn't belong on the polished hospital floors. Lila's mother had called him in a panic after her daughter collapsed during a therapy session in Santa Monica, and Maribel Moreno was the kind of woman who built logistics empires from the port of Long Beach to distribution hubs in Nevada. Someone who didn't panic unless systems were failing in ways she couldn't control. She stood now between Aaron and the medical director, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone white, caught between the authority of credentials and the desperation of watching her daughter suffer through another round of calibration adjustments that only seemed to make breathing harder. Subscribe before you trust the wrong expert with someone you love. The head of the medical team stepped forward, his voice dropping to the tone doctors use when they want compliance without argument, and explained that micro-adjustments in spinal loading were expected during the integration phase, that discomfort was a necessary component of neuromuscular retraining, that the data from Stanford and Houston confirmed the device was performing exactly as engineered. Aaron listened without interrupting, his gaze moving from the doctor's face to Lila's hands gripping the armrests of her wheelchair, then to the base of her spine where the brace disappeared beneath her shirt, then back to the pressure distribution map glowing on the tablet screen. When the doctor finished speaking, Aaron's jaw tightened in a way that made Maribel's breath catch, and he lowered the tablet slowly without saying a word. The medical director asked if he had questions, but Aaron just looked at Lila leaning slightly forward in her chair. Her weight shifted in a direction that didn't match anything the engineers had predicted, and the expression that crossed his face made the nurse near the vending machines whisper to her colleague that something was wrong in a way none of them had noticed yet. Aaron had left his daughter sleeping in their rental house outside Indio at 4:30 that morning. A note on the kitchen counter explaining he'd be back by dinner and reminding her to lock the deadbolt if she left for school before he returned. Nora was 14 and had stopped asking where he went on these emergency calls years ago, had learned to recognize the specific quality of silence that meant someone needed help, her father couldn't refuse, and the drive north through the Coachella Valley in pre-dawn darkness had given him time to review the MRI files Maribel had sent to his phone, while most of Riverside County was still asleep. He worked out of a commercial garage near the I-10 corridor that specialized in irrigation systems and harvesting equipment, the kind of machinery that broke down in ways manufacturers never anticipated and that farmers needed running again before sunrise. His hands carried the permanent stains of hydraulic fluid and soil, and the calluses across his palms came from wrenchwork and metal fabrication, not from anything that would impress a medical review board at a hospital like Cedars-Sinai. The prosthetics work had started almost by accident, 6 years earlier, when a Marine Corps veteran named Torres had asked if Aaron could repair a damaged knee joint the VA couldn't replace for another 8 months. And what Aaron had discovered while taking apart the mechanism was that the engineering principles weren't that different from the pneumatic systems he rebuilt for grape harvesting machines in the Central Valley. Word had spread quietly through veteran networks after that, and now Aaron spent 3 or 4 nights a week in his garage modifying components that insurance companies had classified as unrepairable, matching salvaged parts to individual needs in ways that factory specifications never allowed for. He didn't charge for the work, didn't advertise it, and the only reason Maribel Moreno knew his name at all was because her logistics company had contracted his shop 2 years ago to solve a chronic problem with refrigerated truck suspension systems that kept failing on routes between Bakersfield and the Nevada border. She had watched him identify a design flaw in the hydraulic dampeners that 3 engineering firms had missed, and when her daughter's pain had reached the point where elite medical teams were recommending sedation between therapy sessions, Maribel had called the man who fixed things everyone else declared impossible. Subscribe before someone you love runs out of options that actually work. The medical director at Cedars-Sinai had tried to dismiss him that morning by pointing out that spinal biomechanics required years of specialized training, that agricultural mechanics didn't translate to human physiology, that Aaron's presence was creating liability concerns the hospital's legal team wouldn't tolerate. Aaron had listened to all of it without defending himself, had simply asked if he could see the complete sensor data from the brace's last 3 calibration sessions, and when they'd finally pulled up the files to prove their point, he had scrolled through the pressure graphs in silence for almost 2 minutes before looking up and saying something that made Maribel grip the edge of the nearest desk. The brace wasn't failing, Aaron told them, his voice quiet enough that everyone in the hallway had to lean closer to hear. It was performing exactly the way it had been engineered to perform, which meant the problem wasn't mechanical failure but fundamental design misalignment, and the reason Lila's pain kept getting worse with each upgrade was because they kept perfecting a system that was solving for the wrong variables from the beginning. Maribel had built her empire moving goods that other logistics companies couldn't handle reliably, the kind of temperature-sensitive freight that required split-second coordination between the Port of Long Beach and distribution centers scattered across Nevada, Arizona, and West Texas. Her operation employed 400 people and ran 24-hour dispatch centers in 3 states, and when her daughter's injury had first required intervention 7 years ago, Maribel had approached the medical system the way she approached supply chain problems: identify the best resources, pay for immediate access, and expect results that matched the investment. The orthopedic team at Stanford had designed the first brace using pressure mapping technology adapted from aerospace engineering, and for 6 months it had seemed to work, reducing Lila's pain enough that she could attend classes at a private school in San Marino and participate in physical therapy without needing breaks every 20 minutes. Then the pain had returned during a growth spurt, sharper than before, and the team had recommended a redesign to account for skeletal changes they hadn't anticipated in the original specifications. The second version had been engineered in Houston by a biomechanics lab that specialized in spinal trauma, and it had cost more than most families earned in 3 years. The titanium framework, custom fabricated to measurements taken during a week-long assessment period, where Lila had been monitored by sensors that tracked every shift in her posture. That brace had failed within 4 months, the pain migrating from her lower back into her hips in a pattern the Houston team described as muscular compensation and they had flown her to Boston for consultation with a rehabilitation specialist whose waiting list was normally 18 months long, but who had made an exception after reviewing the imaging studies. Boston had recommended a third redesign incorporating dynamic tension adjustments that could respond to Lila's movements in real time, and when that version had made things worse instead of better, Maribel had taken her daughter to a clinic outside Zurich that treated professional athletes and diplomats who needed treatment without media attention. The Swiss team had been confident they could solve what American medicine had missed, had spoken about biomechanical principles in 3 languages while adjusting sensors and recalibrating pressure points, and Lila had returned to California 3 weeks later in more pain than when she'd left, her spine now carrying the cumulative stress of 4 different engineering approaches that had each promised precision but delivered only escalation. Subscribe before desperation makes you believe the most expensive answer is the right one. They had been standing in that hallway at Cedars-Sinai for almost 30 minutes when Aaron finally asked his question. And later, Maribel would remember the exact quality of afternoon light coming through the windows behind him, the way it made the dust particles visible in the air between where he stood and where the medical director had positioned himself near Lila's wheelchair. Aaron's voice hadn't risen above conversation level, hadn't carried any accusation or challenge, and that's what made the question land with the force it did, because he asked it the way someone might point out that a door was open or that rain was falling outside. He looked at the pressure distribution data still displayed on the tablet, then at Lila sitting motionless in her chair with her hands folded in her lap, and he asked why the load was shifting behind her instead of under her, why every sensor reading showed weight transfer moving backward away from her hips rather than dropping straight down through her center of mass, the way gravity and basic physics would predict. The hallway went so still that the sound of a medication cart rolling past 3 rooms away seemed loud enough to make everyone flinch, and in that silence, the lead orthopedist opened his mouth twice without managing to form words, because no one in any of those facilities across 4 countries had thought to ask that particular question in exactly that way. They moved Lila to a private rehabilitation facility in Pasadena 3 days later, partly to create distance from the confrontation at Cedars-Sinai, and partly because Maribel's legal team had suggested that continued treatment there might complicate the review process if questions arose about protocol deviations. The Pasadena Center occupied a converted office building near the base of the San Gabriel Mountains, its lobby decorated with abstract art that was supposed to communicate healing, but mostly just filled wall space, and Aaron had been given access to a consultation room on the 2nd floor, where he could examine the brace away from the rotating shifts of nurses and therapists, who kept asking if he needed anything while clearly wondering what authority he possessed to be there at all. He had spent the first 2 days taking measurements that the original engineering teams had already recorded dozens of times, checking calibration data that had been verified by specialists in 3 countries, and it wasn't until the 3rd afternoon, when Lila tried to stand during a session and her entire upper body shifted backward in a way that made 2 therapists move to catch her, that Aaron finally understood what he was looking at. The brace wasn't malfunctioning. Every sensor was firing correctly, every pressure point was distributing force according to its programming, and the titanium framework was flexing exactly as the Houston Biomechanics Lab had intended when they designed the dynamic response system. The problem was that all of that precision was being applied in service of an assumption that had never been questioned, an assumption so fundamental that it had survived 4 redesigns and consultation with some of the most credentialed specialists in spinal medicine. The engineers had built the brace to prevent Lila from falling, had programmed it to detect instability and compensate by shifting her weight backward, away from the potential collapse point, the same way a person might lean back when they feel themselves tipping forward. It was elegant engineering solving for a scenario that made perfect sense on paper, except that Lila wasn't falling and had never been at risk of falling in the way the system anticipated. Her body was trying to find its natural center of balance, and every time she got close, the brace detected that forward movement as dangerous instability and pulled her back, creating a cycle where the device fought against the very recovery it was supposed to facilitate. Aaron had explained all of this to Maribel in that consultation room, while Lila sat near the window, watching clouds move across the mountains. His voice steady and factual as he walked through the pressure data and showed her the pattern that emerged when you tracked the sensor responses over weeks instead of individual sessions. The brace wasn't failing her daughter, he told her, and the medical teams hadn't been incompetent or negligent in their assessments. They had built something that worked exactly as intended, had achieved precision in service of the wrong objective, and the reason each upgrade had made things worse was because they kept perfecting a solution to a problem Lila didn't actually have. Maribel had listened without interrupting, her hands gripped together in her lap the way they'd been in the hospital hallway, and when Aaron finished, she asked the question that mattered more than any technical explanation. She asked if he could fix it, if he knew how to rebuild the brace to solve for the right variables this time, and the silence that followed her question stretched long enough that Lila turned from the window to look at both of them. Subscribe before you realize the solution you're chasing was designed for someone else's problem. Aaron met Maribel's eyes and told her he didn't know, that he couldn't promise anything beyond what he'd already shown her, and the honesty in his voice did something Maribel hadn't expected. It didn't reassure her. It terrified her in a way that 4 years of confident specialists had never managed, because it meant the one person who had identified what everyone else had missed was admitting he might not know how to fix it either. They relocated to Flagstaff after the California Medical Board opened an informal inquiry following complaints from the Pasadena facility. 3 families who had witnessed the confrontation with the medical team and had contacted administration with concerns about unlicensed experimental treatment being conducted without proper oversight. Maribel's legal team had recommended distance while they built their response, and the rehab facility outside Flagstaff offered something the California centers couldn't: a borrowed industrial workshop attached to the property, originally built for adaptive equipment fabrication, but unused for the past 2 years since the center had outsourced that work to suppliers in Phoenix. Aaron had chosen the location specifically for that workshop space, for the tools and ventilation systems he'd need to dismantle the brace completely, and when they arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, the Arizona heat was already pressing through the open garage door, hard enough to make the air shimmer above the concrete floor. The smell of metal shavings and WD-40 filled the workshop within hours of Aaron starting his examination. The sound of pneumatic tools from the main rehabilitation center bleeding through the walls in bursts that marked the rhythm of therapy sessions happening 3 rooms away. He had set up his workspace near the back wall where natural light came through high windows, and Lila's wheelchair was positioned in a rectangle of sunlight that moved across the floor as afternoon shifted toward evening, her hands folded in her lap while she watched him separate components with the same methodical patience he'd used on harvesting equipment back in Riverside. The brace looked different in pieces, the smooth titanium framework exposed without its composite housing, and Aaron spent hours each day running his fingers across connection points and sensor mounts, feeling for tolerances and stress patterns that wouldn't show up in any diagnostic scan. He barely spoke during those sessions, just occasionally asked Lila to describe where she felt pressure when the brace was worn, and she answered in the same quiet voice she'd used since Pasadena, as if both of them understood they were working towards something neither could name yet. By the 4th day, Aaron had documented every specification, photographed every sensor array from 6 different angles, and built a complete map of how force traveled through the device from initial contact with Lila's spine to the actuators that adjusted tension in real time. He had filled 3 notebooks with calculations and drawn diagrams that showed load paths the Houston engineers had never considered, and Maribel had started spending mornings in the workshop doorway, watching him work without asking questions that might break his concentration. The texture of the brace components had become familiar to all of them by then. The rough composite housing that protected the titanium skeleton, the flexible sensor pads that felt like thin leather against skin, and the faint smell of medical-grade adhesive that lingered on Aaron's hands, even after he washed them in the industrial sink near the tool rack. Then on the fourth afternoon, Aaron stopped working entirely. He didn't explain himself, didn't announce a decision, just carefully packed each component back into its protective case with the same precision he'd used to remove them, sealed the cases, and stacked them against the wall near where Lila sat in the sunlight. When Maribel asked what he'd found, Aaron looked at her daughter instead of answering, studied the way Lila held her shoulders and the slight forward curve of her spine that the brace had been fighting against for 4 years, and finally told Maribel he wouldn't continue. The brace couldn't help Lila the way it was designed to help, he said, because the injury they'd been treating all this time wasn't the one she actually had. Aaron had told Maribel he wouldn't continue working on the brace, but what he said next made her stand up from the folding chair she'd pulled into the workshop that morning. Lila's paralysis wasn't progressing, he explained, his hands completely steady as he closed the last protective case and secured its latches. Her body had been compensating against constant micro-misalignment for 4 years, building muscle patterns around a device that kept pulling her off her natural center of balance, and every adjustment the medical teams had made had only reinforced those compensatory patterns until her nervous system couldn't distinguish between what was injury and what was adaptation. Fixing the brace wouldn't solve it, Aaron said, because the brace itself had become part of the problem, and what Lila needed wasn't better engineering but a chance to relearn balance without anything fighting her body's instinct to find equilibrium on its own. The fluorescent lights hummed above the concrete floor while Maribel processed what he was telling her, and when she finally spoke, her voice shook despite the controlled precision of her words. She asked if he understood what he was suggesting, if he realized he was telling her to abandon 4 years of treatment from specialists who had dedicated their careers to spinal rehabilitation, and Aaron met her eyes without flinching and said yes, that's exactly what he was telling her. Maribel's hands had gone white where she gripped the back of the chair, and through the workshop window behind her, Aaron could see the empty parking lot where her car sat alone under the late afternoon sun, dust from the unpaved access road still settling on its hood. She asked what credentials he had to make that kind of recommendation, what research supported balance retraining over device-assisted stabilization, and Aaron admitted he had no peer-reviewed studies to cite, no clinical trials to reference, just the pattern he'd seen in the sensor data and the observation that Lila's pain had changed character every time they'd upgraded the brace to be more precise. Subscribe before expertise becomes the reason you ignore what's actually happening. Maribel told him she would call her lawyers in Phoenix, that she'd shut down his access to Lila's medical records and ensure he wouldn't practice this kind of experimental approach on anyone else's child. She said he was asking her to gamble her daughter's future on intuition and mechanical theory, and that if he truly cared about helping Lila, he would work within established protocols instead of dismissing years of accumulated medical knowledge. Aaron listened without defending himself, without arguing the accusations or trying to explain his reasoning any further than he already had, and when Maribel's voice finally broke on the word experimenting, he just nodded once and walked to the door. The sound of his truck engine starting in the parking lot carried through the open workshop entrance, and Maribel stood there watching through the window as he drove toward the access road, not speeding, not hesitating, just leaving in the same deliberate way he'd packed up the brace components an hour earlier. Lila had been silent through the entire confrontation, her wheelchair positioned near the wall where the afternoon light no longer reached, and when her mother finally turned to look at her, the girl's expression suggested she'd expected this ending from the moment Aaron had stopped working 3 days before. Aaron drove west from Flagstaff that evening, with the sun dropping behind him and the road ahead dissolving into the kind of desert emptiness that made distance feel negotiable, and he made it as far as Needles before he couldn't convince himself to keep going. The truck stop sat right on the California border, where Interstate 40 crossed from Arizona, a cluster of fuel pumps and flickering neon that serviced long-haul drivers moving freight between the coast and everywhere else, and Aaron pulled into a space at the far edge of the lot where the overhead lights didn't quite reach. He sat there with the engine off and the windows down, listening to the highway traffic and the metallic ticking of his cooling engine, thinking about the 2-hour drive still ahead to Riverside and his daughter, probably already asleep in their rental house, homework left on the kitchen table, the way she always arranged it when she studied alone. He'd convinced himself during the drive that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross, that suggesting Maribel abandon 4 years of treatment had been the kind of arrogance that came from mistaking pattern recognition for medical expertise, and the worst part was knowing he'd been so certain right up until the moment Maribel's voice broke and he'd realized certainty wasn't the same thing as being right. He slept in the truck that night with the driver's seat reclined and his jacket balled up against the window, and when he woke to the sound of diesel engines idling at the fuel islands, the early light was already turning the Mojave Desert the color of rust and old bone. The drive home took him through 29 Palms and the sand-scrubbed outskirts of Joshua Tree, and by the time he reached his shop in Riverside, he'd made the decision not to contact Maribel again, not to follow up or explain himself further, because the only thing worse than walking away would be trying to justify walking away. He went back to fixing irrigation pumps and rebuilding prosthetics for veterans, spent his evenings helping Nora with geometry homework and pretending the Flagstaff workshop didn't replay in his head every time he picked up a wrench. And if anyone had asked him during those 2 weeks whether he'd helped Lila Moreno or just made her situation more complicated, he wouldn't have been able to answer honestly. Maribel spent the first week after Aaron left making calls to Houston, then Boston, then back to Stanford, lining up consultations and second opinions from specialists who'd treated Lila years ago. By the second week, she stopped calling anyone. She just watched Lila sleep, counting the hours between pain medication doses, and realized she didn't know if the brace was helping anymore or if she just couldn't imagine her daughter without it, couldn't separate the device from the person in a way that let her see what Lila's body was actually doing versus what she feared it might do. The brace sat in its protective cases stacked against the wall of their temporary apartment in Flagstaff, and Lila had stopped asking when they'd returned to California, had stopped asking about next steps or treatment modifications, and that silence worried Maribel more than any medical report ever had. Then, 2 weeks after Aaron drove away from that workshop, someone showed up unannounced at his shop in Riverside on a Thursday afternoon when the temperature was pushing 100 degrees and the overhead fans were doing nothing but moving hot air in circles. Aaron was under a John Deere tractor rebuilding a hydraulic line when he heard footsteps on the concrete, and when he rolled out from under the chassis expecting a farmer with an emergency repair, he found Lila Moreno standing in the doorway with a duffel bag over her shoulder and an expression that suggested she'd already decided how this conversation would go before he'd had a chance to say a word. Lila had convinced her physical therapist to drive her to the Amtrak station in Flagstaff 3 days earlier, claiming she needed to visit a specialist in Phoenix for a consultation Maribel had supposedly arranged. By the time the therapist realized Lila had boarded the Southwest Chief, heading to Los Angeles instead of the southbound connection, she was already 2 hours gone. Her phone turned off and her wheelchair folded in the accessible seating area, while the train rolled through the painted desert toward California. The Greyhound from Los Angeles to Riverside she'd handled alone, texting her mother only after the bus had already pulled into the downtown terminal, and she'd spotted Aaron's shop 3 blocks away on the street. Her phone's map application had highlighted in blue. She told Aaron her pain hadn't stopped after he left Flagstaff, but it had gotten quieter, different, like her body had been waiting for permission to stop fighting something, and his absence had somehow granted that permission without either of them understanding how. Aaron didn't respond right away, just looked at her standing there in the doorway backlit by afternoon sun, and then he unlocked the side entrance to his workshop and asked her to try standing without the brace. She couldn't, not yet, but she didn't collapse either, and that distinction was new enough that Aaron spent the next 10 minutes watching her weight distribution instead of offering to help, studying the way her muscles engaged when she tried to find balance versus how they'd tensed in Flagstaff when the brace had still been dictating her posture. They worked in fragments after that, short sessions spread across afternoons when the shop wasn't busy with agricultural repairs, no equipment involved, and no cameras recording progress for medical review. Just balance exercises, muscle memory training, and the kind of patience that doesn't measure success in metrics, but in the absence of compensatory patterns. Aaron had learned to recognize from rebuilding prosthetics for veterans whose bodies had adapted around loss. Maribel stayed away at first, honoring the legal threats she'd made, even though her lawyers had advised her that informal consultation didn't technically violate any protocols. Then she started watching from the workshop doorway during sessions, standing where Lila couldn't see her, but Aaron knew she was there from the way shadows fell across the concrete floor. Eventually she came inside and sat down on the floor with her back against the wall. Her legs stretched out in front of her like she didn't trust them to hold her weight anymore. And she watched her daughter practice shifting her center of mass without any device correcting or compensating or protecting her from the possibility of falling. When Lila stood on her own for 8 seconds in that shop on a Tuesday afternoon in October, no one clapped or celebrated because the moment was too fragile for noise. Maribel covered her face with both hands and sobbed so hard she scared herself, her shoulders shaking and her breathing coming in gasps that made Aaron move toward her before stopping himself, and the sound filled the workshop in a way that made Lila lower herself back into her wheelchair and wait silently while her mother broke open on something she'd been protecting against for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stop. Subscribe before fear convinces you that protecting someone means never letting them fall. When Maribel could finally speak again, her voice was raw, and she didn't look at Aaron or her daughter, just stared at the concrete floor between her outstretched legs. She said she'd realized the brace had never been the solution, that it had been the shield she used to avoid seeing how afraid she was to let Lila fall, and that every upgrade and redesign had been another way to defer the moment when she'd have to choose between control and recovery. Aaron told her that fear didn't make her wrong, just human, and Lila reached down from her wheelchair to touch her mother's shoulder, in a gesture so quiet it almost disappeared into the afternoon light, slanting through the workshop windows. The backlash came faster than Aaron had anticipated, starting with a regulatory review notice from Sacramento that arrived at his shop 4 days after Lila's breakthrough, the envelope's return address bearing the seal of California's Medical Board Investigative Division. A cease and desist letter, followed from Chicago 2 days later, routed through Maribel's legal team with language about unlicensed medical practice and potential liability exposure that made even her corporate attorneys suggest Aaron retain separate counsel. Then came the warning from a licensing board in Maryland, somehow triggered by the initial California inquiry, suggesting that Aaron's prosthetics work for veterans might constitute medical device modification without proper certification, and threatening review procedures that could shut down his entire operation. Aaron didn't respond to any of it, just filed the letters in a drawer beneath his workbench, and kept working with Lila 3 afternoons a week, watching her balance improve in increments too small to photograph, but too significant to ignore. Maribel had started making calls again by then, but this time to different people, and that's how they ended up at a clinic outside Pittsburgh in early November, meeting with a neurologist named Dr. Raymond Chen, who had quietly resigned from the FDA's Medical Devices Advisory Panel 3 years earlier after voting against a spinal implant that the panel had approved anyway. Dr. Chen worked out of a rehabilitation center that specialized in cases where standard protocols had failed, and his office smelled like antiseptic and old carpet. The kind of place that prioritized function over aesthetics, in a way that made Aaron feel less out of place than he had in any California facility. The doctor spent 20 minutes reviewing Lila's history without commenting. His reading glasses perched low on his nose, while he scrolled through files on a tablet that looked older than the one Aaron had brought to Cedars-Sinai 6 months ago, and when he finally looked up, he asked Lila to walk across the room without explaining why. She made it 11 steps before her balance wavered, caught herself without grabbing for support, and completed the path to the opposite wall, with the kind of concentrated effort that made silence feel necessary. Dr. Chen watched without taking notes or offering encouragement, and when Lila returned to her wheelchair, he looked at Aaron and said something that carried more weight than any technical validation could have provided. He said Aaron hadn't fixed her, that what had happened in that Riverside workshop wasn't repair or treatment in any conventional sense, and that the only thing Aaron had done was get out of the way and let Lila's body remember what it knew before 4 years of devices had taught it to mistrust its own feedback. Then Dr. Chen added something quieter, his voice dropping to the tone people use when they're sharing information they're not sure they should. He said the system doesn't like people who get out of the way, that it needs protocols to protect, and that Aaron should understand the regulatory response wasn't about Lila's improvement, but about the precedent her recovery represented. The document from Washington arrived while Lila was asleep in a rehabilitation dorm outside Reston, Virginia, where Maribel had arranged temporary housing while they consulted with specialists Dr. Chen had recommended in the Fairfax County area. Aaron was standing in the parking lot when Maribel handed him the envelope, the paper heavy in his hands, and the official seal visible through the translucent window. "A temporary injunction," she explained, her voice steady, in a way that suggested she'd already processed the implications and moved past shock into strategic thinking. Not against Aaron directly, but against her foundation, requiring Lila to return to her previous treatment protocol immediately under medical supervision, using the original brace design that had been approved and documented across multiple states. Subscribe before the system decides recovery has to look like what they expect. The justification was procedural rather than medical, focused on compliance and oversight and the protection of vulnerable patients from experimental approaches that lacked institutional backing. No villains appeared in the language, no accusations of harm or negligence, just the steady accumulation of requirements that would effectively undo everything that had happened in Aaron's workshop over the past 2 months. Aaron stood there in the November cold, with the envelope in his hands, knowing exactly what the next phone call would cost him, aware that he had one chance to step back and protect what he'd built in Riverside, or step forward and risk everything for a fight he had no credentials to win. The rehabilitation dorm outside Reston sat on 11 acres of former farmland that had been converted into therapeutic housing in the late 90s, its main building visible from the parking lot through a row of bare oak trees that had already dropped their leaves for the season. Aaron could see the windows of the physical therapy wing on the second floor, the lights still on even though it was past 7 in the evening, and he knew Lila was up there working through the balance exercises they'd refined over the past month. She had progressed to 23 consecutive steps without compensation, patterns emerging, could stand for almost 2 minutes before fatigue affected her center of mass, and the fear that had shaped her posture for 4 years had started dissolving in ways that showed up in how she held her shoulders when she thought no one was watching. The injunction in Aaron's hands would require her to return to the original brace within 72 hours, would mandate supervised sessions with the same medical protocols that had spent 4 years teaching her body to mistrust itself, and the language was specific enough that Maribel's lawyers had already confirmed there was no procedural avenue to delay implementation without risking contempt findings that would shut down her foundation entirely. Aaron had read the document 3 times in the 20 minutes since Maribel had handed it to him, and each reading had made the choice clearer without making it any easier. He could walk away now, the same way he'd walked away from Flagstaff, could return to Riverside and his daughter and the agricultural repair work that didn't generate legal threats from federal agencies, and within 6 months, the regulatory attention would fade because he'd no longer be a person of interest in a case that was really about institutional authority rather than medical outcomes. Lila would survive the return to the brace, would adapt the way she'd adapted before, and Maribel had enough resources to find other specialists who might eventually recognize what Aaron had seen in that first hallway at Cedars-Sinai. The safe choice lived in that direction, the one that protected what he'd built and kept his daughter's life stable and didn't drag him into legal battles he had no credentials to fight. But inside that building, Lila was learning to take her weight without fear for the first time since she was 12 years old, was discovering that her body could be trusted if nothing was actively fighting against it, and forcing her back into a device designed to prevent falls she'd never been at risk of having would undo more than just 2 months of progress. It would teach her that recovery only counted if it happened through approved channels, that improvement didn't matter if it emerged from the wrong kind of expertise, and that the system's need for compliance outweighed her actual experience of getting better. Erin knew what that lesson would cost her, had seen it in veterans whose bodies had healed around prosthetics that insurance companies refused to replace because the modifications hadn't been documented according to protocol. The November wind carried the smell of wood smoke from somewhere beyond the property line, and Erin's phone had been vibrating in his pocket for the past 10 minutes with messages he hadn't checked yet. Through the second-floor windows, he could see shadows moving in the therapy wing, could picture Lila working through her exercises with the concentrated determination that had carried her from Flagstaff to his workshop without permission or assistance. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, the way documents feel when they represent more than just paper and ink, and Erin understood that the next phone call would determine whether he spent the next year fighting regulatory agencies or watching from a distance while someone else's daughter learned that improvement wasn't enough if it challenged the wrong assumptions. Subscribe before silence becomes the reason someone's progress gets erased. He didn't open the car door right away, didn't reach for his phone, or walk toward the building, or make any of the decisions that would commit him to one path or the other. He just stood there in the parking lot with the injunction in his hands, looking at the lit windows above him and the road stretching east toward home, knowing that whatever happened next would depend on a choice he hadn't made yet.